Shortage occupations, they get to skip the first step of the green card process, which is normally labor certification. Welcome back to Visa Vibes, where we unpack all the latest in U.S. immigration law with real world strategy and a little bit of sanity. I'm Emily Newman, managing partner of Reddy Newman Brown PC.
And I'm Stephen Brown. I'm also a partner at Reddy Newman Brown PC. And today, we're here in Houston, one of the largest medical centers in the world. And we get asked all the time, what are the options for nurses? There is a well-known nationwide shortage from nurses. My wife's a nurse. Your daughter's a nurse. They can tell us there's a shortage. So how can employers bring in nurses, international nurses, to fill those critical roles? And today we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, healthcare systems are really looking for everywhere for these staffing solutions, travel nurses, retention bonuses, new grads, like how can we get more kids to go into nursing? But increasingly, they're having to rely on international recruitment. The biggest challenge employers face with that, though, is choosing the correct immigration strategy for the specific role and being aware of the timing that goes into it, because there are changes that happen with that can really impact how long it takes to actually get boots on the ground, in the job.
Yeah, and real quick plug here, we have an upcoming webinar later on this month that's going to go more in depth, but it's important to know, Emily, not all categories fit in every visa category. Nursing's a wide field, right? You have RNs all the way up to nurse practitioners. You get specialized nurses and all that. Some qualify for, temporary non-immigrant visas, some don't. Others, especially RNs that don't qualify for a TN, because they're not Canadian or Mexican, are going to have to go through Schedule A EB3, which has a backlog for every nation. And so companies that are looking to supplement their workforce with international nurses kind of have to forecast out, okay, we could do this in 4 years. And that's tough.
Yeah. So one of the most common work visa options is the H-1B for specialty occupation workers. So let's talk H-1B first. How does that work for nurses specifically? Well, it doesn't always.
Right.
Most of the time it doesn't. Not all nursing roles will qualify for that. So it's really roles that require a master's or higher degree, because the position itself has a higher level of education needed, that higher specialization, so it qualifies as what we call a specialty occupation. So examples are the nurse practitioners, clinical nurse specialists, CRNAs, certified nurse midwives, but your typical RN does not qualify for an H-1B.
Yeah, and it's important to know why. So there are plenty of nurses that have a bachelor's degree, but there's plenty of RNs that also just have an associate's degree. They just went to nursing school, and that's great. They did great work, but immigration, the H-1B focuses, does the position typically require a degree, a bachelor's degree or higher in a specific field? And so it's not whether the nurse has one. We could be talking about an RN who had a 4.0 bachelor's degree program, but because she's an RN, probably won't qualify for an H-1B nurse. So that's why we have to look at these advanced practice roles that usually meet that standard, because, state license or nationwide certifications tend to require that graduate level education, like nurse practitioners. That is a lot stronger evidence for an H-1B, because you can't become a nurse practitioner without that master's level degree.
Yeah, and so then there are some other roles that might qualify that aren't bedside, but still require that advanced training using those nursing skills at professional judgment. So, like nurse educators, infection prevention, quality improvement, clinical informatics, nurse managers, unit directors, these higher level roles that can qualify for H-1B, because typically the most common way to get qualified for one of those roles is a bachelor's or higher degree program.
Yeah, so this is going to be a little bit of a trickier battle for an H-1B, but you can still show that the minimum requirement for the position is a bachelor's degree or higher. So think about, what does the company require? If you talk about Methodist Hospital or Memorial Hermann here in Houston, I'm sure they have a 1,000 job postings that you could look through that what they require. Maybe they all require a bachelor's degree. You could show what did they hire, what are the organizational charts that show that kind of that supervisory authority. These cases, they're going to be a lot more document heavy, right? You can't just show the bachelor's degree and be done with it. You're going to have to prove it up. But it can be winnable. It's just, it's one of those things that it's what does the company have? If we're saying, look, we'll take someone with an associate's degree, but we really like this person. Well, yeah, what do the documents show? And that's why it makes it tricky, but not impossible.
Yeah, you really have to show that hiring history and what your job vacancy announcements show for the to set those education requirements. So let's kind of hit the big question head on. Why is it that your typical bedside registered nurse is almost always not eligible for an H-1B?
Yeah, and again, this is no disrespect for nurses coming from either of us, right? But typically, the H-1B requires that there's a uniform acceptance of a bachelor minimum level of bachelor's degree or higher. For RNs, U.S. licensing boards in many states accept associate degrees for RNs, and so USCIS follows the Department of Labor, and they say, all right, associate's degrees are going to be accepted and all this work. And there's memos USCIS has said that generally speaking, RNs are not going to be accepted as specialty occupation because they don't typically need a degree in degree in a specific field. And so because the associate's degree can work, that kind of hampers it. Again, not impossible, just not common either.
So that leaves for the vast majority of bedside nurses really the green card, the EB3 green card process, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But what if you happen to have a bedside nurse who was a citizen of Canada or Mexico?
Yeah, this is great. So one of the TN categories is registered nurse. And so it will talk about the requirements in the USMCA, and registered nurses that are Canadian or Mexican nationals can get a TN visa and work in the US.
All right. Yeah. I mean, it's literally in the USMCA, which used to be NAFTA. And so it specifies what the credentialing requirement is, what the licensure requirement, and then they can enter on a TN. And it's a fast process. There's no cap, there's no quota, there's no lottery, there's not even a petition filing.
No, I mean, you talk about like Canadians, like they could go to the port of entry tomorrow.
Yeah. Now, Mexicans, they do need to apply for the visa first, so they have to get a consular appointment, but it's much more workable than your typical H-1B and way faster than, of course, an EB3 green card. And also, there's no specialty occupation analysis. So you don't have to prove that this particular nursing job requires a bachelor's degree. You just have to prove that this job, the person meets the credentials that are spelled out in the USMCA. So it's one of the cleanest and easiest non-immigrant routes for eligible nurses, but only if you're a Canadian or Mexican citizen. So now let's go into kind of the more long-term option if you don't qualify for an H-1B and you don't happen to be Canadian or Mexican, and that's the EB3 green card process. So registered nurses were, set by the Department of Labor as being a shortage occupation along with physical therapists. That means that they have this special process called Schedule A because they're on the Schedule A list as shortage occupations. They get to skip the first step of the green card process, which is normally labor certification. So the whole goal of labor certification is for an employer to prove that they could not find a qualified, willing, able, available U.S. worker for the job in their location, and therefore that means they're going to hire a foreign worker for that position. Well, since the Department of Labor already said there's a shortage of U.S. workers, we don't have to go through that long drawn out perm process, which can take 2 years. We go straight to filing the I-140.
Yeah, and it's definitely worth mentioning. So we skip the recruitment process, we skip that perm process. And like Emily said, this isn't a loophole, right? This is Department of Labor has already said we have a shortage. Like we need nurses in here, so you don't have to go through this process. And so when they get the immigrant visa petition, they file the I-140. There's going to be supplements. You're still going to submit documents that you can show all the requirements are met and all. And now it's a question of doing adjustment of status in the US if they're here on a non-immigrant visa that allows you to adjust, or consular process. And this is the part that's hard. And you and I were talking about this ahead of time. We talk about it with NIW all the time. There's still limited visa availability. There is backlogs in EB3 for every country. Obviously, we know China and India are backlogged more severely, but everybody has a backlog for EB2 and EB3. And so when we talk about Schedule A nurses, the Department of Labor says, oh my gosh, there's a shortage. You don't have to go do the labor market test because there's a shortage. And then Department of State, because of the visa bulletin, and again, this is all through Congress, but oh no, you've got to wait. You can't really fill this role that we know there's a shortage of until you meet this bureaucratic timeline. It's the same complaint I have with NIW, right? Oh, you're in the national interest and can continue that job, but like, wait.
Not that urgent.
Like it doesn't make any sense to me, like many things in immigration. You look at EB5, how they pulled out in 2022 certain categories that they were like, we want to focus on rural and high unemployment areas. Well, Congress could do the same thing. That doesn't require a giant change to say we're going to prioritize a little bit or pull out EB3, Schedule A and NIW. And have they done something like that before?
Yeah, they actually have. So back when I started practicing, I actually did quite a few Schedule A cases because the priority date was current for everybody. It didn't matter where you were born. You could get a green card within 6 months to a year because there was no waiting period. And the reason for that, if you can believe it, was actually based on the Real ID Act of 2005.
Which is finally implemented.
I was just going to say that. Like, it only took 20 years, but in 2025, we finally have those driver's license with the little star on them. We all feel so much safer now.
I feel much easier going to the airport, right?
But as part of that, they actually recaptured 50,000 green cards that had gone unused from a previous fiscal year and set them aside exclusively for Schedule A. So nurses and physical therapists had their own little pool of 50,000 green cards. So employers still filed the I-140. They still had to get a prevailing wage, post a notice of filing, and all those things. But those petitions jumped to the front of the line because they had their own separate pool. And so that program fueled a lot of Schedule A filings in 2005, 2006, 2007, and then all of a sudden those 50,000 green cards ran out. And then Schedule A goes back into the EB3 category. So back then, that was the Real ID Act was the reason why hospitals were able to bring in so many nurses and physical therapists so quickly from outside the country when they didn't have a non-immigrant visa option and the only option was this green card process. But they did end up running out in late 2006, and then that category retrogressed in 2007. Now, from 2007 to 2022, basically, the rest of the world, besides India, China, Mexico, Philippines, that EB3 category was generally current. So you could still, if you were not from one of those four countries, pursue the EB3 process, not have to wait in this backlog. But then June 2022, green cards started becoming more demand for the whole world. And so those rest of world green cards ran out in the EB3 category, and we've been stuck with a cutoff date ever since, and that date is not getting better for sure because the demand is still there.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I talked about this at the beginning. We've talked to hospitals. We've talked to around the nation, but I've, in meetings with hospital providers here in the Houston area, and it's okay, like we want to do this, but it's like, okay, cool. In like 4 years, right?
Yeah.
The consular process, and there's a, retrogression on rest of world, and, so they're stuck. They're kind of like, we need to supplement our nurse force. We've identified candidates abroad, but you're telling me I can't do this for about 4 or 5 years. Don't shoot the messenger, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit of strategy, because I think people sometimes go down the wrong path by not being strategy first. I mean, H-1B for a nurse makes a lot of sense. I know I have family members that have gotten bachelor's degrees. You do. I mean, it seems very common here in 2025. But, you can't always just go H-1B. Now, advanced roles, I think you can make that case. Canadian, Mexican nationals, look at the TN. Now, we also have to think about the immigrant intent issue, right, with TN. And so you might need to be strategic about your EB3 with the Schedule A because it is going to be a wait. There is a backlog. And maybe you've got a consular process, that process, and you can continue on your TN while you do that consular processing. But get the licensing documents, go through the NCLEX, get your state licensure up to date, and be deliberate going through this process.
Yeah, and it's really important that there's a lot of moving parts through this. And so there needs to be communication between HR, between the actual candidate, between nursing leadership, credentialing, immigration council. Everybody has to kind of communicate and work together and be in alignment to make the process go as smoothly as possible, because that will help companies be able to fill these critical roles faster.
Yeah, that's why, I always tell clients, and I think nursing's a good example. Like, we got to be a team. Like, I can help you out on the immigration side, but you guys got to help me out on the licensing side and making sure all that's getting done on your end. And, it's all got to be communication.
All right, so let's do a kind of quick FAQ round here.
All right, let's do it.
All right, so can a hospital sponsor a bedside RN for a work visa?
Not typically for an H-1B. They can for a TN, and then yes, for the EB3 Schedule A.
So how do most nurses immigrate to the US?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it with the Real ID Act. A lot have gone through that EB3 Schedule A process where companies kind of project their nursing workforce, like what do we need in 4 or 5 years, and we can supplement. Some advanced roles can go through the H-1B, nurse practitioners, and then we have TN for Mexican and Canadian nationals.
Yeah, so speaking of TN, what is the
Yeah, TN, right? For Mexican and Canadian, but they have to be credentialed, and I think that's important. And there are steps in place on how to go through the NCLEX and get the licensure because it's kind of a weird chicken or the egg thing sometimes with TNs where states are like, well, you need to be lawfully allowed to work before you can get licensure, but you can't get lawfully eligible to work without a license. And so there are ways to work that process. It's just getting to the right people sometimes.
Yeah, so does the nurse need to pass the NCLEX before they can start working?
Yeah, absolutely. So they must meet U.S. licensure requirements before starting any employment.
All right. So, whether you're employer planning, international recruitment, or a nurse exploring options, understanding which roles qualify and what those pathways look like and the timeline is essential.
Yeah, and speaking of guidance, our firm, we do monthly webinars, and they're pretty in-depth, a lot more formal than our awesome podcast. But we have one coming up on nurses and physicians.
All right. So, yeah, it's called Work Visa and Green Card Options for Nurses, which roles qualify and how to prepare. So, I think we'll have a link to that on our social media as well as in the show notes here. So, you can definitely register for that webinar.
Yeah, and you can always reach out to us too. If you're like, hey, we listen to this, we want to learn more, like I'm happy to get you that link. But our team's gonna talk about timelines, strategy, real world examples, and how to navigate these cases because again, sometimes it is about projection and not I need this tomorrow.
Yeah. So, join us, get your questions answered, leave with a workable roadmap for how these different categories can work for you.
And thanks for joining us today. If you have any topics that you are interested in, always feel free to reach out to us.